There's a particular kind of silence in old financial records, not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of something having been carefully removed. I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was following a curiosity about municipal debt in the early 20th century, the kind of research that puts most people to sleep when I started noticing that certain ledgers, certain property transfers, certain deed registrations from the years surrounding 1913 had an unusual quality to them. They accounted for everything going forward with meticulous precision. But when you tried to trace what those assets had been before, what they were built on, who had held them, where the original capital came from, the trail dissolved. Not abruptly, gradually. Like a path that becomes fainter the further back you walk it, until you're standing in an open field with no trail at all. The year 1913 is typically taught as a year of reform, progressive era legislation, the income tax, the Federal Reserve. Woodrow Wilson arriving in the White House with an agenda that the textbooks describe as bringing American finance into the modern age. And that framing isn't exactly wrong, but framing is a choice. You can describe an inheritance settlement as modernization too, if you write the description carefully enough. 2 amendments to the Constitution were ratified in 1913. That alone is historically unusual. In the entire 19th century, only 5 amendments had passed. The 16th, ratified in February, authorized a direct federal income tax. The 17th, ratified in April, changed how senators were elected. Both altered, in fundamental ways, the relationship between the federal government and the flow of money. Both had been debated for years and stalled for years. And then, in 1913, both moved through ratification within months of each other. The speed, after such long resistance, deserves a question. And before the year was out, in December, the Federal Reserve Act was signed. Now think about what those 3 things, taken together, actually constructed. A mechanism to tax income directly and invisibly. A Senate now elected by popular vote rather than appointed by state legislatures, making it more responsive to national financial interests than to regional ones. And a central banking system with the authority to issue currency and manage credit at a national scale. By the end of 1913, the United States had assembled, in under 12 months, the complete institutional framework for managing a modern financial empire. The question worth sitting with is, what was the empire it was built to manage? Let me take you back to 1907 for a moment. The Panic of 1907 began with a failed attempt to corner the copper market and cascaded into a full banking crisis within weeks. Banks across the country faced runs. Trust companies collapsed. The New York Stock Exchange nearly failed. And the man who stopped it, not the government, not any existing institution, but a single private citizen, was J.P. Morgan. He physically gathered the city's most powerful bankers in his library on Madison Avenue, locked the doors, and refused to let anyone leave until they agreed to pool their reserves and stop the panic. It worked. The crisis resolved. The official memory of this event is that it demonstrated the need for a central bank. What it also demonstrated was that one man in one private room could decide the fate of the American financial system, and that man and the network around him had the liquidity to do it. The question that rarely gets asked is where that liquidity ultimately originated. What was backing it? Because the capital Morgan was moving was not simply accumulated profit from industry. It was something older and larger than any single industrial enterprise, something with roots that predated the men wielding it. This is where the Tartarian question enters. Carefully, not recklessly. The hypothesis is not comfortable, and it is not proven, but it has a specific testable shape. It holds that the grand architectural and infrastructural inheritance visible across the 19th century Western world, the civic buildings, the railway terminals, the customs houses, the wide boulevarded capitals that appeared seemingly overnight in cities that had been modest towns just decades before, was not built by the civilization that claimed it. It was inherited, absorbed from a prior order whose traces were systematically overwritten, whose assets were reclassified under new ownership, and whose memory was filed away in archives that have never been made fully public. Consider the pace of what was built officially between 1850 and 1895. Washington, D.C.'s State, War, and Navy Building, now the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, was constructed beginning in 1871. The granite alone required quarrying and transporting millions of cubic feet of stone. It took 17 years to complete and employed hundreds of workers daily. That timeline at least breathes. That one, you can almost believe. But then look at the post offices. The federal post offices constructed across American cities between 1880 and 1910 share an architectural coherence so precise, so consistently executed in granite and marble with identical neoclassical detailing that they look less like independent construction projects and more like a single coordinated distribution, as if someone were allocating existing buildings to new administrative functions rather than commissioning them from scratch. In Portland, in Denver, in Savannah, in Galveston, the same arched windows, the same load-bearing masonry, the same interior proportions that feel slightly oversized, in a way the human eye catches before the mind names it. Not dramatically oversized, just slightly. Doorways a few inches taller than function requires. Ceilings a foot higher than the era's construction economics would have recommended. Staircases with treads cut for a stride just slightly longer than standard. Not giants. Nothing so cinematic. Just a consistent, subtle wrongness of scale that runs through building after building, city after city, across a period when the official construction record is already straining credibility. And then there is the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 200 buildings, constructed on reclaimed marshland beside Lake Michigan, completed in under 2 years. The architectural coherence was so complete, the neoclassical detailing so accomplished, that visitors arriving by train described the sensation of entering a different civilization. The principal buildings were enormous. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building was the largest enclosed space in the world at the time, covering more than 30 acres under a single roof. And it was built officially as a temporary exhibition. The explanation given for the subsequent demolition is that the buildings were constructed from staff, a composite of plaster, cement, and jute fiber, and were never meant to survive more than a season. But look at the photographs, not the wide promotional shots, the detail photographs, the ones taken by private visitors with personal cameras, capturing columns and facades and interior vaulting at close range. The surfaces show weathering. The stonework shows depth and shadow that a plaster composite cannot produce. The question is not whether all 200 buildings were permanent. The question is how many were not temporary at all. How many were already standing when the exposition began? How many were simply included in the exhibition's footprint, given a fresh coat of staff over existing stone, and then described as new construction in the program guide? That question has never been satisfactorily answered. It has, for the most part, not been asked. Now come back to 1913. By the time the Federal Reserve Act was signed, the process of rationalizing American property and asset ownership had been underway for decades. The Homestead Act of 1862 had begun the systematic conversion of land from unregistered territory into titled property within a federal recording system. The General Land Office had been working since 1812, But the pace of land registration accelerated sharply after the Civil War in the 1870s and 1880s, precisely the period when those architectural anomalies were being absorbed into official civic inventories across the country. Buildings appearing in city records without clear construction histories, land parcels with ownership chains that began without explanation in the 1860s or 1870s and had no documented prior title. The income tax, in this context, represents something more specific than a revenue mechanism. It represents visibility. Before 1913, the federal government's financial reach was bounded by what it could observe at ports and borders, the physical movement of taxable goods. After 1913, it could see income. Wherever wealth flowed, whatever form it took, the government could now follow it and take a portion. That kind of visibility is extraordinarily useful if you are managing an inheritance that spans hundreds of properties in dozens of cities and needs to be maintained, transferred, and eventually liquidated without attracting more attention than necessary. The Federal Reserve, in the same breath, provided something equally useful, a mechanism for creating credit against assets. You don't have to sell a building to extract its value. You can use it as collateral. You can borrow against it, deploy that capital elsewhere, and retain the underlying asset indefinitely, which is a perfectly ordinary observation about banking, unless the assets being leveraged had origins that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Jekyll Island is worth naming here because it has been confirmed. In November 1910, 6 men traveled by private railcar from New Jersey to Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private club accessible only by boat whose members included Morgan, Vanderbilt, and Astor. They traveled under assumed names. They spent 10 days drafting what would become, 3 years later, the Federal Reserve Act. Senator Nelson Aldrich led the group. The others were senior representatives of the largest banks in the country and of the European banking interests connected to them. The meeting was not publicly acknowledged for years. When it was finally confirmed, it was reframed as a straightforward policy drafting session, brilliant men solving a difficult problem in comfortable surroundings. Maybe that's all it was. But I noticed that a secret meeting to design a national banking system, held at a private estate owned by the country's wealthiest families, produces a slightly different atmosphere than a government committee convening in a public building. It produces the atmosphere of an estate being settled, of custodians deciding among themselves how the inheritance will be managed going forward, of men who already know what is in the vault, agreeing on who will hold the keys. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress and was signed by Wilson on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas. The timing was later criticized as deliberate, a moment when Congress was distracted, when public attention was elsewhere, when a significant piece of legislation could pass without the scrutiny it might otherwise receive. The critics were dismissed as conspiracy theorists, but the date is the date. The record is the record. And then 1913 closed, and the new architecture of American finance was complete. What followed over the next decade was the systematic consolidation of exactly the kind of assets the new system was built to manage. The great private estates began transferring into institutional hands. The old post roads and railway corridors that ran through properties without clear title were formalized under federal authority. The remaining land in the American West that had never been homesteaded, that had simply existed in legal ambiguity since the surveys were drawn, was reclassified, registered, and assigned. By 1920, the map of American ownership looked radically different than it had in 1900. Not because new things had been built, because existing things had been properly filed. I want to be precise about what I'm suggesting and what I'm not. I'm not suggesting that the men at Jekyll Island were aware of a Tartarian legacy in the way that we discuss it now. I'm suggesting that they were aware of assets, properties, institutional structures, accumulated reserves, whose origins were complex and whose ownership was contested or obscure, and that the financial framework they constructed in 1913 was, among its other functions, a machine for absorbing those assets cleanly into a new order of documented ownership. The Federal Reserve didn't need to know where the buildings came from. It just needed to hold them as collateral and issue credit against them. The income tax didn't need to know who had originally accumulated the wealth it was taxing. It just needed the wealth to be legible, trackable, reachable. The prior civilization, if there was one, didn't need to be acknowledged. It just needed to be absorbed. That's a different kind of erasure than burning records, more efficient, and considerably harder to reverse. Because the records that replace the old ones are real records. They're filed. They're legal. They have the full authority of the institutional framework that created them. And that framework has had over a century to normalize itself to become the background assumption against which all inquiry takes place. So when you look at a federal building from 1887 and feel that something is slightly off about the proportions, when you look at the timeline of the world's Columbian Exposition and find it doesn't quite add up, when you trace a property record backward and find it starting without explanation in 1871, you are not looking at evidence of fraud in any simple sense. You are looking at the seams of an absorption, the points where the old world was stitched into the new one. And in December of 1913, they finished the stitching. I don't know what was on the other side of that seam. I don't think anyone alive does, not fully. But I find it difficult to look at the precision of that single year, the completeness of what it assembled, and believe that it was simply about modernizing credit markets. People who are only modernizing credit markets don't need to meet in secret on an island. They don't need to do it in the same year the government first gains the ability to tax income. They don't need to do all of it at once. They need to do all of it all at once when something has to be locked down before anyone thinks to ask what it is. The vault was closed in 1913. The question that stays with me, the one I haven't been able to set aside, is not who closed it. It's what was already inside.